This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, our very special guest, Dinesh DSouza, the #1 New York Times bestselling author and author of the new book, The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Dinesh, what an honor and a privilege to have you back on the Glazov Gang.
Jamie, it's always great. Good to be on the show.
Fantastic. Dinesh, I don't know a book that's more timely. The Big Lie and what just happened in Charlottesville and the way the media's covering it. Let you start, because the Big Lie is also the Big Lie About Charlottesville. So why don't you just begin?
Yeah, Charlottesville is almost a sort of gift to the left because it creates the perfect tableau for them. In other words, the perfect narrative. On the one side, you have the Ku Klux Klan guys. You have the neo-Nazis. Some of them wearing Trump hats. On the other side, you've got the left valiantly fighting against these racists and fascists. And so this feeds the narrative of the left, which is that Trump is a fascist and that the Republican Party, the conservatives are, if you will, the party that it is either fascist or accommodates fascism. And the left is the heroic resistors of racism and fascism. Now, this is the race card and the fascism card rolled into one. And it is the exact focus of the book, The Big Lie. And my argument is that exactly this media narrative about Charlottesville is the big lie. It's the big lie in action. And the big lie at its core isn't even about Trump. It's simply the lie that fascism and Nazism are right-wing phenomena. What I demonstrate in the book, ideologically, historically, in terms of any meaningful senses of the term, fascism, Nazism are left-wing phenomena, and we are being subjected to a great distortion of what those things actually mean.
Absolutely. Dinesh, when I read your book, it's just so fascinating. So many things you bring up that I really didn't know, and just amazing. So let's go further here. So white nationalism, despite what the media says and what the left says and Democrats say white nationalists actually belong with the Democratic Party.
Well, look at it this way. The Democratic Party is the party of ethnic nationalism. The Democratic Party affirms all types of ethnic nationalisms and encourages every group to be proud of its heritage, to celebrate it, what makes it distinct. The left says this is what enhances diversity. So every ethnic nationalism is accommodated in the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party invented white nationalism, which was once the core of its own political identity. But now, today, the Democrats have changed. Now they are for every other ethnic nationalism except white nationalism. And I think this is actually why the white nationalists, who would normally be comfortably in the Democratic Party, they can't really go to the multicultural picnic now, because they would discover soon enough that they're unwelcome. In fact, they are Satan.
Wow. Dinesh, let me take a detour sometimes, and then we'll get back on thematically. The left, the way it hates Trump, we understand how they like to tar and to smear with the word fascist, etc. But they really have a hatred for Trump. And you have said, and I think this is definitely true for us conservatives that fight political war, understand, and we fight culture war. Trump is a fighter. He doesn't surrender, and they can't stand that. Is that part of it?
He's a very dangerous figure for the left. Let's contrast for a moment Trump with Reagan. Now, Reagan was very effective. But Reagan's strategy, for example, with the media was to go over the heads of the media. Now, that was a very effective strategy, yes, but Reagan wasn't threatening the media. He was simply, in a sense, bypassing it. Trump, on the other hand, opens fire directly on the media. He attacks them openly. He attacks them by name. He ridicules them. This is something that is almost unprecedented. These guys are not used to it. They're used to being the moral arbiters of American politics, being, if you will, above the fray, and Trump has drawn them in the fray.
Absolutely. He does fight back, and they don't know really what to do. They're furious. Look, in terms of some of these slanders, they really love to go at Trump about immigration. And, especially after his inauguration, there are all these people coming on the media. No one is safe. No immigrants are safe. My producer, Annie, that's from a Sharia environment. I'm from Russia. Dinesh, you're also an immigrant to my knowledge. Are you afraid? Do you not feel safe as an immigrant? Expose for us this lie that Trump is somehow against immigration.
Jamie, yeah, this is the height of absurdity. I'm a legal immigrant from India. My wife is from Venezuela. Neither of us feel unsafe in the slightest. Here's the thing. I keep hearing about how Trump has made a racist attack on immigrants, just like Hitler. This is part of the whole fascist indictment of Trump. Well, number one, the distinction for Trump is not a racial one at all. It's between the legal and the illegal. Now, remember that most legal immigrants who come to America now are not white. They don't come anymore from Europe so much. Most immigrants today come from Asia, from Africa, from South America. Now, Trump has never said, I want more legal immigrants from Australia, Canada, and England, and fewer from India or Barbados. He's never said that. So Trump is not drawing a racial line at all. And if we want to pursue the Hitler comparison from the other side of the aisle, Hitler wasn't even talking about immigrants. The Jews weren't immigrants. They lived in Germany. They were German citizens. And so Hitler was making an internal division within Germany between the sort of Nordic superior types, according to him, and the Jews who were the source of the problem. So this Trump-Hitler analogy collapses on both sides of the seesaw.
Absolutely. Dinesh, growing up, wanting to come to the United States, and I wanted to come to the United States, I never worried about a wall. It's incredible how the media on CNN, MSNBC, it's incredible what they get away with. They'll be like, oh, well, Trump, he's really against immigrants, with the wall. Why is a wall connected to immigration?
I mean, I almost feel like laughing because never once did I think that the way to come to the United States was basically just to sort of jump over a line. I kind of assumed that there would be an actual process and I'd have to go through immigration officials. And so the concept of having a wall, whether a real wall or a wall in theory, makes perfect sense to immigrants who know that every other country polices their borders.
Absolutely. Dinesh, look, incredible what the media, this establishment leftist media, does not talk about. So they're going on and on about Charlottesville. And what do you know? The organizer of that white supremacist rally turns out to be an individual by the name of Jason Kessler. And it appears that the thesis of your book solidifies and confirms something going on here, because who is this individual?
Well, I was very struck by this. I saw a reference to him, and so I went to the Southern Poverty Law Center website. Now, these guys, as you know, are hardly right-wingers. They're actually left-wingers, and they monitor these hate groups. And there on the website, I read, wow, this guy Kessler, the organizer, the white supremacist organizer of the hate rally, is an Obama guy and is an Occupy Wall Street guy. Now, this makes no sense. And so you would think that all these investigative reporters of the New York Times and CNN would be on this, trying to figure out what's the real story about Charlottesville, because it seems there's got to be something fishy here. It's almost as if the Charlottesville thing was rigged or set up in some way to feed the media's narrative. In other words, to confirm the big lie. And yet I see nothing else about it. It's almost like there's a deadly silence surrounding that simple but possibly very significant fact.
Right. Dinesh, there's a certain phenomenon in the world. The Nazis call the Israelis often Nazis. The Palestinian Nazis, that death cult, they call the Israelis Nazis. And you talk about in your book something very fascinating, transference. The way that the left and the Democrats use transference to hide something about themselves.
Yes, this concept, transference, is in the psychological literature. I believe it might have been first used by Freud. Freud just noticed that patients who exhibited certain qualities, let's say, for example, a pathological hostility to other people, would nevertheless identify that quality in other people. They'd say, oh, my wife is pathologically aggressive and hostile. Oh, my kids are so hostile. But actually, it was the guy himself who's hostile. So he's taking his own sins, if you will, projecting them onto someone else. Now, the reason I call this a big lie is it's one thing to say when a charge comes up, let's say, for example, is the Democratic Party the party of racism? It's one thing for the Democrats to say, no, we're not. And that would be a lie because the Democratic Party has a 150-year, almost uninterrupted racist history. But it would be a lie for them to say we didn't do it. But it's a big lie for them to say not only did we not do it, but the Republicans, the very party that fought against us, that is the party of emancipation, the party of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the party that fought segregation, shut down the Ku Klux Klan, the party that enabled the civil rights legislation of the 60s. We're going to blame racism on those guys. That is a double lie because, in a sense, you're not only exonerating yourself of something you're guilty of, but you're taking a completely innocent party and making them guilty.
Right. And so, we look at Antifa. They dress up as ISIS. They shut down speech, cause riots, break everything down with violence. We see what happened when Coulter and Horowitz tried to speak at Berkeley, for instance. But they pretend that they're anti-fascist. Black Lives Matter. They talk about racism, but they enable an environment where white people are killed and police officers are killed. Is the BLM and Antifa a good example here?
Yeah, they're a very good example of not only of transference, but they both exhibit a fascist streak. And in fact, I would go further and say, the media is pressuring Trump, single out the white supremacists, make them in a way the gravest national danger this country has ever faced. Now, this in itself is a huge, huge and monumental lie. Why? Because this ragtag bunch of residual Klansmen, they have no serious political power or cultural power in this country. If the Klan today were to hold a rally in pretty much any part of the country, they'd be lucky to get 4 dozen people to come, and they'd be surrounded by 5 times as many protesters. Now, the Klan at one time did have real power. In the 1920s, for example, 50,000 Klansmen in white hoods marched right up Fifth Avenue. Where were they going? Madison Square Garden. For what purpose? The Democratic National Convention. Many of them were delegates. So the Klan, when it had real power, was the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party. Now it has very little power, but the Antifa guys are part of a much larger movement, which has real power. Antifa can keep conservative speakers off the campus. The white nationalists can't. Antifa is part of a larger movement that dictates what books get read on the campus in the first place. So I'm much less worried about a handful of guys doing a demonstration once every year or once every 5 years. I'm much more worried about the fascism of studio bosses who can destroy your career if you speak out in the wrong way, academic deans who control billion-dollar endowments, who get to decide whose academic career will prosper and whose will be ruined. This is the fascism of the institutions, even more dangerous than the fascism of the street.
Thank you. And Dinesh, what's just incredible, I mean, I can't get hours of my life back sometimes because I analyze the left, I watch CNN, MSNBC, and the last couple of days, there's just zero about what you're speaking about right now. And what I find very interesting is that they pretend they invite these conservative right-wing Republican spokesmen. But, I got to say, they're very, very weak. It's almost like intentionally they invite people that they know are not going to make the proper argument. Dinesh, were you invited on CNN or MSNBC to discuss who Antifa and what your book is about in this context?
Jamie, that I predict will not happen. These guys are running scared. I mean, it's so funny because since the election, I've seen almost uninterrupted bloviations about fascism from Van Jones, Bill Maher, Rachel Maddow, Chris Matthews. Now, Rachel Maddow says, I've been reading the early speeches of Hitler because I see some important analogies to what's going on today. Now, if these people had a shred of integrity, they would say, all right, well, here's Dinesh. He's a smart guy. He went to the same schools we did. He's written this book. He seems to know what he's talking about. Let's have him on and let's have a real debate about whether fascism and Nazism are on the left or on the right. And does the modern left or the modern right more closely exhibit the characteristic traits of fascism? if they did that, I think they know that if they did that, they would be totally destroyed. They'd be made to look like complete fools. They'd be shown to know nothing about these subjects that they continue to pontificate about. They inwardly know that. And so they're not going to do it. They'd rather have some staged debate in which they can continue to spout their nonsense, and they'll go completely unchallenged.
No, absolutely. The other night I was watching Anderson Cooper and then Don Lemon, and he's, like you said, he's staging this debate, but the quote-unquote Republican is just not making the argument. And I was thinking they would never dare have Dinesh on because he just wrote a book about this, but they will not invite you.
Well, part of it is I would go right after the core of their narrative. I mean, even take the Charlottesville business. It's really all about this Robert E. Lee monument. Now, Robert E. Lee is a very ambiguous, if you're trying to find a bad guy, with regard to slavery, this is a very odd man to choose. First of all, he made many principled statements against slavery. He did have some slaves, but he inherited them on his wife's side, and he was a military general, so he wasn't running a plantation or anything like that. He was opposed to secession. He was offered by Lincoln the command of the Union Army, and the only reason he didn't take it is he didn't want to make war on his own relatives in Virginia. So this is not exactly the baddest of the bad guys. Now, there are some really bad guys, and most of them are icons in the Democratic Party. Robert Byrd, half of West Virginia is named after Robert Byrd, this former leader in the Ku Klux Klan. I don't see Antifa pulling down his monuments. Now, what's really going on here isn't just that they're being selective or they're being hypocritical. It's not that. It's that they are pursuing a larger lie, which is that they're taking the crimes of the Democratic Party and, in a classic act of transference, blaming it on the South. That's why, for example, they'll never pull down the Stephen Douglas monument in Chicago. He was a Northern Democrat. He was in alliance with the Southern Democrats. He protected slavery. But if they go and pull down his monument, it disrupts their blame the South narrative. That's why Antifa will stay away from Stephen Douglas.
Right now, Dinesh, something happened, like, historically, you document, you demonstrate this whole, the Nazi roots of the left. And then at a certain moment around World War II, as you show, the left succeeded in burying its past. Even everything about FDR and JFK's views and everything that they did. How did they succeed in this?
Well, starting in the 1950s, the progressives began to establish a dominant position in all the three big megaphones of our culture. And those are academia, the media, and then the whole entertainment industry, including Hollywood. Now think about it. If you have the control of those three megaphones, you can put out a whole bunch of big lies. And even if some guy in Peoria knows different, there's not much he can do about it because he doesn't have a big enough megaphone to contradict you. So the left basically looks back at its own sordid history. And boy, is it a sordid history. Here's Woodrow Wilson, progressive icon who almost single-handedly revived the Ku Klux Klan. Here's FDR, who was not only infatuated with Mussolini and sending members of his brain trust to fascist Italy, but FDR is also putting a former Klansman on the Supreme Court. FDR is also cutting deals with racist Democrats in which FDR agrees, to block anti-lynching legislation and to leave blacks out of New Deal programs. Here's JFK going to Nazi Germany in the 30s and coming back effusive with praise of Hitler, whom he calls a legend even as late as 1945. So my book is just dense with this kind of information. It's completely irrefutable. Not one fact in it has even been seriously questioned, let alone refuted. And so yet this is all the big treasure trove of evidence that the progressives go, we got to bury this stuff. There's no way we're putting this in the textbooks. We can't afford to let young people find out about this. And so about the same time they go, let's figure out a way to take fascism from the left-wing column and move it over to the right-wing column. This will require some clever redefinition of fascism. We have to kind of get the socialism out of National Socialism, for example. But I mean, this is one of the greatest acts of intellectual hijacking in the 20th century. And you're right, to a large degree, it worked. And that's why when I blow it up, all kinds of people on social media, they can't believe it. They think it's self-evidently ridiculous what I'm saying, even though what I'm saying is the actual historical truth.
Absolutely. And for some reason, I don't think we're going to see CNN and MSNBC even discussing one of these facts. But let's get to some of these facts. Just incredible. I had to sometimes turn back to the page and read it again. On the eve of the Civil War, 1860, how many Republicans owned slaves, and who were the slaves in America owned by?
In 1860, the year of the Civil War, the number of Republicans who owned slaves is exactly 0. And at that time in the country, there were about 4 million slaves, and all those 4 million slaves were owned by Democrats. Now, I actually made this statement in Hillary's America, my last movie. And the reason I made it is because when I would talk about the two parties and their role in slavery, a lot of people would say, kind of well-meaningly, Republicans too, well, Dinesh, you know what, don't be so kind of strident on this topic because there's an awful lot of blame to go around. In order to clarify what that means and to sort of state the issue as starkly as I could, I put out this kind of challenge. And think of it, it's a very refutable statement that I made in the sense that all you have to do is give me the names of 3 Republicans who owned slaves, and I'd have to take it back. But 1 year later, after massive thrashing and all kinds of research projects trying to prove that single statement wrong, there's not been a single counterexample to what I said.
Thank you, Dinesh. You know, just another incredible fact you bring up that I don't think Don Lemon and Rachel Maddow and Anderson Cooper will ever discuss. You know, in my studies of, the Soviet Union, those totalitarian monstrosities of Hitler and Stalin, we know that Hitler and the Nazis learned from Lenin, learned from Stalin. They were inspired by the concentration camps, other forms and the ingredients of the death camps, concentration camps, etc. But I was very interested in your book. You show that Hitler and the Nazis also took their ideas from the Democrats on segregation.
Yes, I outlined 3 lessons that Hitler learned either from American progressives or specifically from the Democratic Party. And you mentioned one, so I'll elaborate. When the Nazis got together to draft the Nuremberg Laws, these are the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which outlawed intermarriage between Jews and other Germans, which segregated Jews into ghettos, which involved state-sponsored discrimination against Jews and later confiscation of Jewish property. So the Nazis were very excited. They thought that they were establishing the world's first racist state. They even had a stenographer present to record the meeting, which they thought had historic significance. And one of the Nazis who had happened to have studied in the United States kind of spoiled the picnic by saying, sorry, guys, we can't create the world's first racist state because the Democratic Party in the American South has already done it. Everything that we want to do, they've already done. We want to do outlawing intermarriage. They have anti-miscegenation laws. We want to segregate. They already segregate. We want state-sponsored discrimination. They've been there. So all we need to do is take the democratic laws as a blueprint, essentially cross out the word black, write in the word Jew, and we're off to the races. And so the Nazis then sit around looking at the blueprints of the democratic laws and get into a sort of an intense debate about how these laws can simply be modified to create the Nuremberg Laws. So I knew that there were when I started the book, I knew that there were some chilling similarities on both sides of the Atlantic, but I had no idea that the high-level Nazis are actually sitting around swapping and debating and using as a reference point for the Nuremberg Laws, the laws of the Democratic Party.
But Dinesh, one very interesting fact that you discuss is that it turns out that when the Nazis were agonizing about racial identity and some of their own rules that they were going to make, that the left, the Democrats, were actually too racist for them. Right.
Well, this is almost, I owe this observation to the Yale legal scholar James Whitman, who discovered a very interesting sideline to this debate. The Nazis were basically considering the question of who is a Jew. And so they turned to the Nazi who studied in America and they said, well, how do they solve this? How do the Democrats deal with this issue since there's been intermarriage and intermixing? How do you peg a group? And so this guy says, the Americans, Democrats have an excellent solution. It's called the one-drop rule. Basically, if you have any discernible quantity of black blood, you're black. And the Nazis look at each other and they go, whoa, that's way too much for us, man. We can't go along with that. In other words, as you say, they thought the Democrats were too racist for them. And in fact, the Nuremberg Laws took a much softer line. You had to have 3 Jewish grandparents to automatically qualify as Jewish under the Nuremberg Laws.
Wow. Dinesh, name me a Democrat who has represented Democrats in admitting and apologizing for the racist history of the Democrats.
This is the remarkable thing. At a time when the media and the left are pressing Trump to apologize for things that he never did, a history that is not his, and in fact for a Republican Party that's been the good guy on this issue, the Democratic Party, the party of slavery, the party that invented the notion of slavery as a positive good, the party that at the end of the Civil War opposed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the party that blocked Reconstruction, the party that imposed segregation and Jim Crow. Think of it, every Jim Crow law in the South, every segregation law was passed by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Democratic governor. There's no exception to that rule. And the party that mounted opposition to the civil rights movement. The opposition to the civil rights movement did not come from the Republican Party, but from the Democratic Party. So this party, with this unbelievably sordid history, has never admitted it, never apologized for it, never taken responsibility, and never paid one penny in restitution.
I think that being leftist means never having to say you're sorry. Dinesh, there's also, look, so many lies. I think there's also a lot of mental illness, hysteria, ignorance. You give lots of examples. For instance, MSNBC host Rachel Maddow, she has this one claim that the Trump era is reminiscent of, quote, what it was like when Hitler first became chancellor. Dinesh, anybody that knows anything about history would never mangle history in such a way. How is this a psychological also disturbance, mental illness, a collective Munchausen syndrome of some kind? What is it?
Well, I'm not sure I could, even if I wanted to diagnose it. But what I will say is that I was watching recently this press conference with Trump in which the issue of Charlottesville was bandied about, and you could see that these reporters were, they were shaking, they were trembling. Some of them seemed to be on the verge of tears, and you got the feeling that they were trying they had the view that the greatest threat to American democracy comes from ragtag members of the neo-Nazi movement and the Klan. Now, they probably suspect that these guys are regular attendees at the Republican Party. I can tell you, Jamie, I mean, my first book came out in 1991. I've been a Reaganite since the early 80s. I have been to and spoken at innumerable GOP Lincoln dinners and Reagan dinners. My wife almost humorously asked me the other day, she goes, how many times at these meetings have you seen a Nazi or a Klansman or a skinhead? And I go, never. I mean, this is absurd. Anybody who is in the Republican Party knows that these people are not a presence in the party. And so what you have really is a media-generated alternative universe. In that universe, one set of things are true. And then in the real world, which the rest of us live in, they're not true. It's almost like the weatherman telling you on the television, it's raining outside. You look out the window, it's not raining. And so you got to say, am I going to believe that guy or my lying eyes?
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Dinesh, so much. Let me get back to one thing here in terms of, just the media is just so appalled that Trump could even have said anything about both sides. But look, they're not going to invite you on to explain this. But you document in your book that the Democratic left has an ideology that's identical with fascism. And these Antifa guys and all these other leftists, many of them in all these groups, they consistently borrow tactics of intimidation and political terror from the Nazi brown shirts. So major props to Trump for pointing this out. Could you just open our eyes a little further on this? The Antifa are also fascists.
I mean, Trump, if anything, understated the case immensely. And here's what I mean. The economic policy of the Democratic Party right now is essentially classically fascist. And what I mean by that is consider Obamacare. Obamacare isn't socialism because in socialist countries, they nationalize industry. They nationalize the banks, or they nationalize the healthcare industry. Now, we have a private healthcare industry. We have private hospitals. We have private health insurance companies. But who tells them what to do? The government. Who sets prices? The government. Who decides eligibility? The government. So we have state run capitalism, which is the classic definition of fascism. So ideologically, economically, the fascist commitment to the centralized state, we have that in the Democratic Party. Now, under Obama and Hillary, we have also seen something that is very chilling: the use of the organs of the state against your political enemies. I mean, I experienced the force of that myself. When the state deploys the Justice Department, investigators, they've got your tax returns, FBI members are reading my books. I mean, the whole power of the state against a solitary individual. Now, and the ragtag white supremacists can't do that. The Ku Klux Klan can't do that. They just don't have the power. But these leftists, once they burrow their way into the government, can deploy the full, the SWAT teams, the political, the legal power of the federal government against Tea Party groups, against conservatives. This is the fascism of the institutions, and this is the most dangerous type of fascism in America. It's not some guy marching on the streets of Charlottesville.
Thank you, Dinesh. Now, in your book, I mean, so much originality. For instance, Hayek and Jonah Goldberg, they set the foundation for this discussion. But you do a lot that's new, and one of the things you do is you show how fascism and Nazism grew out of a debate within socialism. Such a crucial thing to discuss and to demonstrate because, of this whole myth that fascism and Nazism somehow are on the right, and you show that it came from within the left. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yes, I think sometimes if you want to understand the core of a thing, you don't just look at the definition, but you look at its genesis. You look at how it actually came about. In the 19th century, Marx had made some very extravagant predictions. He expected communist revolutions to break out in countries like England and Germany. And by the end of the 19th century, it was obvious that this was not happening. And this produced something that historians called the crisis of Marxism. Intelligent Marxists sat around and said, listen, Marx sort of as written is not going to work. We need to sort of revise and modify Marx. We need, if you will, some kind of new interpretations of Marx that are going to be more practical for the new century. And out of that great debate, the crisis of Marxism, came two new hybrid forms of socialism. The first is Leninist Bolshevism, which was itself an innovation from the original Marx, something new. And the other was Mussolini's fascism. Let's remember Mussolini was a Marxist. He was the most prominent socialist in Italy along with Gramsci, and he remained a socialist to the end of his life. So fascism is a form of socialism, really distinguished from communism mainly by the fact that communism is international socialism and fascism is, as Hitler would later call it, national socialism.
Dinesh, tell us a little bit about George Soros. And I was interested, you had shown in the book how he actually considered himself to be and wanted to be a god. Very interesting.
Yeah, he talks about his own messiah complex. This is a very strange and bizarre man. But I think what's particularly interesting is that he kind of portrays himself, sort of like Antifa, as a kind of anti-fascist, a champion of freedom and openness. His philanthropic group is called the Open Society Foundation. But Soros has a very interesting sort of fascist history. And it came out in an interview that Steve Kroft of CBS News did with Soros, in which Steve Kroft said, isn't it true, Mr. Soros, that when you were a teenager, you and a bunch of other guys in your native Hungary, which was then Nazi-occupied Hungary, you went into Jewish neighborhoods, were confiscating the property of Jews and turning it over to the regime, which was under Nazi control. Isn't that a fact? And Soros goes, yes, it's true. And then Steve Kroft says, well, you were a teenager then, but you're a mature man now. Looking back on all that, don't you think this was disgraceful? Don't you feel a sense of remorse or regret? And Soros goes, absolutely not in the slightest. I didn't create the situation. I just took advantage of it. Those things were happening anyway. So this is very interesting. I mean, can you imagine, Jamie, if somebody in the Trump administration had this actual background of not only being Hitler's collection boy in the past, but having no regrets about it even in the present?
Dinesh, just got a couple minutes left. You talk about, the title of your book, The Big Lie, and you talk about how Hitler coined the term, the big lie, because, he was very proud of this and cynically knew that, the great masses of people will fail for a bold and monstrous lie. And today, we know that the left is very successful also in the big lie, right?
Yes, Hitler's point was that small lies are relatively easy to catch because you can compare them to some empirical reality. You can check them out, in effect. But a lie that's so big that it's hard to get your head around it. I mean, think of the lie that, for example, says that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party switched places. Now, on the face of it, it's absolutely preposterous. It's kind of like saying that one day in the country, the cops and the criminals switched places. It's unlikely, but it's very difficult to sort of refute. There's some, if you look at the South, for example, the South used to be largely Democratic. It is now largely Republican. So it takes a lot of sophistication to be able to probe in and show why this is actually a big lie, that there was no big switch, that in fact, as the South became less racist, it became more Republican. But a lot of historical knowledge, a lot of empirical data is needed to blast a big lie. And that was Hitler's point. Big lies are easier to sell. And that's why the left has had the success that it has so far.
Dinesh, before we go, just under 2 minutes, just very quickly, I'm just going to throw a couple names at you. Who is Obama?
Obama is a very strange guy. He's a beneficiary of the American dream, and one might expect he would be an enthusiast of the American dream. But he has adopted the perverse anti-colonial philosophy of his father, in which he sees America as the bad guy. He wanted to take America down a notch, both economically and in terms of its power in the world, and he did.
Now, how about Romney? He really embarrassed himself recently on Twitter and social media in terms of how he responded to this whole Charlottesville narrative.
It really shows you how terrible some of these Republicans are, how just invertebrate in dealing with really difficult challenges when they come. I'm kind of amazed at the way that Romney, by the way, Romney has a lot less money than Trump. And yet when the left attacked Romney for being a rich guy, for being a plutocrat, I mean, this poor guy was flailing in the wind. There's nothing he could say. They had him pegged up against the wall. With Trump, look at this. No one can even accuse him of being a rich guy because the moment you do, he tells you he's even richer than you think. And so Trump has sort of immunized himself against this charge of plutocracy. Trump is just a far better politician and a far better president than Romney ever could be.
Thank you so much, Dinesh. In closing, what can we do to fight the big lie? Because look, the left just dominates our culture, the popular culture, the media, academia. It seems hopeless sometimes, and a lot of conservatives don't know how to fight culture war. Your thoughts?
My strategy is to take the book, push the arguments out there, test them against the wind of counter-argument, and then convert these intellectual arguments into a emotionally powerful film, which I'll release next summer for the midterm election year. That's my way of trying to create a megaphone to compete with their megaphones. It's a smaller megaphone, but nevertheless, I think we can make progress. I think the Hillary's America movie and book helped to blunt the race card. Today, if you go on social media and you try to connect David Duke to the Republican Party, 40 other guys will put up memes of Robert Byrd in his Ku Klux Klan outfit. The race card by itself isn't working quite so well by itself. That's why the left has migrated to the fascism card. So I think information is powerful. If we can take away these trump cards, if I can use that term, that they play against us, almost trying to win the debate in advance, then we'll start to make some progress.
Dinesh, in all honesty, I really want to thank you because you're one of the culture warriors on the front lines, and I think it's undisputed that your books and your movies very much helped the defeat of Hillary and bringing Trump in, and you played a big role in saving America for now. Your thoughts on that in terms of the role you think your work has played?
Well, I would just say that if our movie, I think our movie did have a positive effect. I'm certainly personally extremely relieved not to have that horrible woman in the Oval Office. And so if we played a small role in helping to make that happen, I would be very grateful that that was the case.
Okay, Dinesh, for all of our viewers that are very excited, I think that if they want to get The Big Lie, they go to DineshDSouza.com or BigLieBook.com. Anywhere else?
Or they get it off Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's available in Costco and Walmart. The books are everywhere. So grab a copy because I think you'll find it equips you, particularly in this tempestuous moment of American politics.
Dinesh, thank you so much for fighting for the truth, for uncovering the truth, and fighting all these evil forces trying to defeat America and our freedom. Major props to you. Thank you for everything that you do.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And make sure you get Dinesh DSouza's The Big Lie, a must read. Thank you for watching the Glazov Gang this evening. We'll see you soon. Good night.